When we look at the core topics,
we're still talking about it today, 100 years later. Not many misdemeanor cases can say that.
100 years ago, one of the most famous and controversial cases in American history was heard inside a small courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee. The state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes became known as the Scopes Monkey Trial and put the debate over teaching evolution in schools on the front pages of newspapers across the country. The man in the middle of it all, 24-year-old John Scopes, taught in the public high school in Dayton and included evolution in his curriculum. He agreed to be the focus of the test case, challenging a newly passed Tennessee state law against teaching evolution or any other theory denying the biblical account of creation. The case became known as the trial of the century and was attended by hundreds of reporters and others who crowded the courthouse in the sweltering July heat. Joining us to discuss this famous case are Rick Dye and Tom Davis. You might say these men are the heart and soul of the Ray Heritage Preservation Foundation. Welcome, gentlemen.
thank you.
I'm Samantha Fisher, Communications Director for the Tennessee Supreme Court and the Administrative Office of the Courts, and I'm excited to co-host this episode with my colleague, producer Jordan Alcorn, who has done a great job researching this case and will be kicking off the interview. Jordan?
Thank you, Sam. Rick, Tom, thank you guys. What are you guys doing for the 100th year anniversary of the Scopes trial?
The keystone is the reenactment on July 11th and 12th, 18th and 19th. We'll have performances of the play Destiny in Dayton, which is an adaptation of the trial transcript in the courtroom where the trial was held. So when you come into the courtroom, see the play, you are hearing words that were spoken in that room 100 years ago.
It gives an audience the experience of, as Tom said, you're in the actual courtroom. Courtroom has been preserved. You're sitting in the actual chairs. And in this case, you're hearing the actual words of William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow.
And can you speak also to the economic impact that the yearly Scopes Festival has on the community there?
The two actual weekends that we produced the play, you're looking at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people either come to the production or just visit Dayton to see the courthouse and to get a feeling of what Dayton was like in 1925. Because a lot of the buildings and businesses, and we have a walking tour where you can see the historic places that have been saved over the years. And it does give you a sense of what it was like to walk around a small town that was the focus of the universe for 11 days.
And we had last year, I think it was folk from 9 states and what was it, 24, 30 communities in Tennessee outside of Ray County come. So it makes an impact in that way. They eat, they buy gas, shop. So people notice.
Now, economic impact, the promoters of the trial in 1925 were looking for an economic impact. Dayton was primarily a agrarian community. In fact, our biggest event each year is a strawberry festival because for many years that was one of the biggest crops of the area. The only industry that existed 100 years ago was the Dayton Coal and Iron Company.
What is one of the big takeaways or just overall general reactions that you hear from the public after they watch the Scopes play reenactment?
But the number one takeaway lesson that I think people get is that for those 8 days, these people walked into that courtroom at 9 o'clock. They chose their respective side. And until 4 o'clock, they argued with all the passion they could muster. But at 4 o'clock each day, that stopped. Dayton's not that big. There weren't that many places to go have dinner. There weren't that many hotels to stay in. These people had to walk up and down the street together. At 4 o'clock, it all stopped. They got along. They had civil conversation. They broke bread together. They got to know one another and have conversation about issues outside of what was argued in the courtroom. And here we sit 100 years later. We're still having many of the core arguments, and we still have just as much passion in those arguments. We just can't seem to find 4 o'clock and take a pause.
Tom, I wanted to jump in with a question. I thought what you said about the civil discourse following the day's arguments was so interesting. And we didn't have video cameras at the time to record the arguments. So much of the perception of the trial has been told through authors and books and things like that. I'd be interested in hearing from both of you about this. What do you think over time has become the biggest misconception about the trial?
I think that both sides hated each other, that this was a duel to the death, and they meant it. But like Rick said, they fought like that in the courtroom. But Ben McKenzie, one of the prosecuting attorneys, and Clarence Darrow, let's just say, became buddies.
They met during the trial for the first time they'd ever met, and they remained friends for the rest of their life. With the Darrows visiting, with the McKenzies visiting the Darrows in Chicago, and Darrow even returned to Dayton to fish the Hiwassee Refuge with McKenzie. They became very close friends. In fact, it's in some lore it said that Darrow spent evenings drinking bootleg liquor with members of the prosecution. He did. He would join McKenzie each evening in his office, where McKenzie would have a bottle of gin driven in by a taxi from Chattanooga. It was not moonshine. It was the good stuff, but it was prohibition, so everything was bootleg. But yes, I think in Darrow's autobiography, he comments how he and by the time Darrow got to town, there was no hotel rooms left. So he stayed in the home of Luke Morgan, one of the bankers in town. The Morgan family had a place out on a mountain where the temperatures were a little cooler. They went there and allowed Darrow and his wife to stay in their home on 2nd Avenue. In his autobiography, he commented how he and his wife returned one Sunday evening, knowing that there was no chance of having any ice for the ice box, the chance of finding any cream or butter or anything for breakfast were going to be slim to none, only to get to the house, open the ice box, and realize that the neighbors up and down the street had gotten a big slab of ice, some fresh churned butter, some cream, and as he said, even a melon for breakfast, that he and his wife, for the first time, had tasted true Southern hospitality, and they would never forget it.
So, Rick, this is a question for you. So, when you are playing Darrow, what do you do just to get into character there?
I walk off by myself for a little while before we start. I think Darrow is a fascinating character. That he could spin these arguments with no notes. I have put a lot of effort into studying his mannerisms as best I can find from what little video there is and still pictures. I do think Darrow is key to making the event what it was. It's interesting, as you can tell, the mix in the audience. There's a little sway in which side the audience favors. So sometimes I get more cheers and sometimes I get more jeers.
So the Scopes trial became the first American trial to have live updates going out over the radio. Media landscape has changed dramatically since then, but can we compare the hysteria that surrounded the Scopes trial at that time similar to any trial coverage that we've seen more recently?
Well, there were more than 100 reporters that descended on Dayton to cover the trial, led by H.L. Mencken. Of course, he's the one who coined the monkey trial, said if the South is the Bible Belt, Dayton must surely be the buckle. He painted a very harsh image. He despised Bryan. He was very mean towards Bryan, and he was very mean towards Dayton in general. And that led most of the media coverage. It was the first trial to be broadcast by a broadcast medium. Radio was only 5 years old. The first paid commercial broadcast was KDKA out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is still on the air. But they were paid to broadcast the 1920 presidential election returns. WGN, which was owned by the Chicago Tribune, the call letters, world's greatest newspapers, where they get their call letters. The Tribune had only owned WGN about two and a half years, and it's one of those little covered up things. But it's interesting to note that they had actually had great difficulty getting on the air the first day because it was the first time they had 4 microphones in the same room. And so they had some feedback issues and stuff that they were not aware of. So it was a technical challenge. They paid WGN paid $1,000 a day to rent the AT&T lines from Dayton to Chicago to be able to broadcast the trial. It also created the first airstrip, landing strip in Dayton. They plowed down a section of a cornfield on what is today about 11th Avenue so that they could fly newsreels in and out. So you not only had the radio broadcasting the trial daily, but you had the newsreels going out to the movie theaters all over the country at the same time. So it was a full media circus frenzy.
They figured, 65 telegraphers sent about 200,000 words a day during the trial, had to install additional telegraph lines for the community for them to handle this. So Bryan has said there have been more words sent from Dayton about this trial than any other event in American history. That's kind of how big it was.
How has the portrayal of the Scopes trial in popular culture, like the movie Inherit the Wind, how has that influenced the public's understanding of what actually happened?
It is the antithesis of what actually happened. It's almost that extreme. Again, people need to understand Lawrence and Lee, when they wrote Inherit the Wind in 1955, they were after Senator Joe McCarthy. Their entire focus was McCarthy and his extremism and his red listing. Ironically, believe it or not, when the movie came along 5 years later, it actually debuted right here in Dayton, Tennessee. United Artists contacted the leaders, said, we're making a movie about the trial, and it's clear from all the communication, no one asked what movie. So yes, the community got together, went and found John Scopes living quietly in Louisiana, brought him back to town, had a huge parade, gave him a key to the city, and then went down to the movie theater and watched Inherit the Wind, and they were not happy.
Rick, I wanted to ask you about William Jennings Bryan because he did not live long after the trial. What impact do you think that had on the trial's legacy?
Well, it certainly plays into the Inherit the Wind version, that's for sure. The sad part is it causes him to be depicted as being crushed by the trial when, again, it was just the opposite. He was jubilant. He thought he had won a great victory, was parading around, giving speeches, but he was his own demise. He was a full-blown diabetic. We didn't have insulin back then. We didn't understand the diet and so forth. And there's actually two stories there. According to his cook, he spoke for the last time that day at the Methodist Church, delivered the services that Sunday. They went to the Rogers home where they were staying. It said, according to his cook, he consumed 2 entire fried chickens and laid down quietly and went to sleep and didn't wake. The other story is Tom Stewart, who was the district attorney, lead prosecutor in the case. In Mr. Bryan's travels and speaking, day before, I guess it was, that Saturday before coming back, they stopped at the Stewart home in Winchester, and Mrs. Stewart threw a quick gathering the neighbors and so forth, meal together, and Bryan dearly loved tomatoes. So I guess there were 2 platters of sliced tomatoes, and he loved them smothered in salt. So according to Chancellor Stewart, the grandson of Tom Stewart, his grandmother believes she contributed to Mr. Bryan's demise by eating a platter of tomatoes, by eating all of those tomatoes.
But he was very confident that this was both you might say, the culmination of his life's work, but it was a battle that he had won that needed to be continued. And he was willing to do that. He was ready to do that.
And one of the things that's always fascinating to the attorneys and legal minds that attend is that Darrow's great stunt of actually calling Bryan to the stand always fascinates people from the legal arena. And it was unprecedented. As I said, Darrow spent the entire weekend rehearsing that examination, prepping for that day. When Bryan agreed to take the stand, he expected Darrow to quiz him on evolution, not on the Bible. So the whole thing set a scene. And as I said, Darrow went after the unanswerable questions. Well, if God punished the serpent by making him crawl up on his belly, how did he move before that? Did he stand up on his tail? So those are questions that are easy to pick apart in a public arena, and understand that the day that Darrow examined Bryan, that was the day, because of the high temperatures, as you mentioned, the judge moved court outside. So there were probably 3,000 people on that courthouse lawn during that 2 or 3 hour examination. How all these people came together, and even Scopes himself, school had ended on May 1st. He had intended to leave town to go visit family in Paducah, Kentucky, but he stayed in town hoping to meet a young lady that he was interested in. And that's the only reason he was in town on Monday the 4th when the newspaper ad came out. So how's all that timing and everything come together? And then again, the regular biology teacher, he certainly was not willing to take on the subject. It was only after some discussion that they realized that Scopes had substituted, and he might be more a willing candidate. As Scopes said himself, he said, well, I'm certainly willing to stand for the case if you can prove I taught it.
Are people fascinated by that when they attend the reenactment, that so much of this was set up ahead of time to test the law?
Oh, absolutely. Oh,
yeah.
That's part of the fun for us, is to have, like I said earlier, like people, I had no idea. After the play, the cast will gather behind the bar and people will come up and talk and ask question after question. How did this happen? Where did this come from? And it's encouraging to us to have the cast interested enough to do some research on their own so they can answer. In the playbill that we send out a week or two before the show, we address many of these questions for people so they realize, well, like F.E. Robinson's daughter told me one time, this was a serious trial. My father really wanted to know whether the law was valid, but he never missed a chance to boost his community or his business. So she didn't like to call it a publicity stunt, but he didn't miss a chance. So all of these things, it's the stories of real people doing real things that really matter that get people excited. And I think coming into the same courtroom, sitting in the same seats, listening to the same words, as one of our former Bryans used to say, if you're really quiet, you can almost hear the walls echoing those words from 1925. That makes history come alive. And I think that's what makes what we do so significant, because it is real.
You get into the little stories after, as Tom said, the audience will usually linger around. They'll have questions, and they're interested in the minutia. I mentioned that Bryan loved tomatoes. He also loved radishes. And so it said when walking around town, people would offer him, because again, in a rural agrarian-based community, everybody had a little home garden. They probably had a chicken or two, and they had a cow or a goat. And so as he would walk around, they would give him tomatoes and radishes. And it said he would carry salt in one pocket and pepper in the other pocket so that he could flavor the items as people gave them to him. I mentioned that Mackenzie and Darrow became friends and would go across the street each evening to Mackenzie's office to have a drink of gin. And they argued in the courtroom, where Darrow challenged Mackenzie, said, so you believe a man is made in the image of God? When you see a man, you're seeing God. And he goaded Mackenzie to the point, and Mackenzie turned to him and said, well, I realize it was difficult on our maker to choose to make some so profusely ugly. But yet that same day, they went across the street and had a drink.
Well, gentlemen, I have so enjoyed some of the nuances and particulars and interesting details that you have brought to this discussion. It's clear why this still fascinates people 100 years later. We just have one last question for you.
In summary, what do both of you say is the lasting legacy of the Scopes trial, and what would you say is its relevancy for us today?
The lasting legacy is that we can have full, open debate, true debate, not debate that ends in name calling, but discussion. And that we can end that discussion and say, we will have to agree to disagree, but we will still respect you and your view, and we will ask you to respect us and our view.
That's so critical. And I think another part of it is so often small towns. Nothing ever happens here. I've got to get away from here to make something of myself. But I think if you look at the Scopes trial, particularly, if you look at other events in history, big things can and do happen in small towns, in small places. And I think it behooves us who live in some of those places to remember that. We may be small, but we can make a difference if we put our minds to it and work toward a common goal.
And here again, here is a case. Nobody was murdered. Nobody was lynched. Nothing was burned. Nothing was destroyed or damaged. And again, this was a misdemeanor charge. And that it can draw that much attention is fascinating in itself. And again, when we look at the core topics,
we're still talking about it today, 100 years later. Not many misdemeanor cases can set that.
Gentlemen, one last question. If folks, listening to this interview are intrigued and want to learn more, where should they go to learn more?
The best location right now for the Centennial Celebration is scopes100.com. Extensive website giving you all the information about everything we have leading up. And we've even learned a couple of things that might go on after July this year. So we intend to make the most out of the 100th anniversary of the world's most famous court trial.
Rick Dye, Tom Davis, thank you so much for coming on Tennessee Court Talk.
Thank you
for having us.